This is Radio Caravan, the world news read by Shabnam Modgil. 4 people have died and over 50 arrested after hundreds of President Trump supporters stormed the U.S. Capitol yesterday in a bid to overturn his election defeat. The arrests related to breaking the 6 p.m. curfew as well as charges related to carrying unlicensed or prohibited firearms. But the one woman who was shot inside the Capitol was 35 years old and had served in the Air Force and was from the San Diego area, and 3 others who died after suffering medical emergencies. The shooting occurred after violent supporters of President Trump breached the U.S. Capitol as a joint session of Congress to count the electoral votes and affirm President-elect Joe Biden's win was underway. The Capitol complex was locked down and lawmakers were evacuated, halting the count after only 2 states had been completed. Troops from Virginia, Maryland and Washington, D.C. National Guard were deployed to help quell the violence. At least 14 members of the Metropolitan Police Department were injured, including 1 officer was dragged into the crowd. 6 firearms and 2 pipe bombs were recovered, as well as a cooler of Molotov cocktails. The chaos in the U.S. Capitol yesterday unfolded after President Trump spent weeks whipping up his supporters with false allegations of fraud in the election, culminating in a call to march to the building that represents U.S. democracy. The storming of the U.S. Capitol is a jarring but natural product of years of violence and hateful rhetoric stoked by disinformation and conspiracy theories. Members of the far-right groups, including the violent Proud Boys, joined the crowds that formed in Washington to cheer on President Trump as he urged them to protest Congress's counting electoral college votes confirming President-elect Joe Biden's win. Then they headed to the Capitol. Members of smaller white supremacist and neo-Nazi groups were also spotted in the crowds. Police were photographed stopping a man identified as a leading promoter of the QAnon conspiracy theory from storming the Senate floor. The bloody chaos inside the Capitol yesterday came after police force that protects the legislative complex was overrun by a mob of Trump supporters in what law enforcement officials called a catastrophic failure to prepare. The siege of the Capitol, home to both the U.S. Senate and the House of Representatives, represents one of the gravest security lapses in the recent U.S. history, turning one of the most recognizable symbols of American power into a locus of political violence. And for weeks, President Trump and his supporters had been proclaiming the 6th of January as a day of a reckoning, a day to gather in Washington to save America and stop the steal, as he said, of the election that he had decisively lost, but which he still maintained, often through a toxic brew of conspiracy theories, that he had won by a landslide. And when that day came yesterday, the president rallied thousands of his supporters with an incendiary speech. Then a large mob of those supporters, many waving Trump flags and wearing Trump regalia, violently stormed the Capitol to take over the halls of government and send elected officials into hiding, fearing for their safety. U.S. media captured the unprecedented storming of the Capitol. The storming of the Capitol by these supporters of President Trump played out on television in searing fashion yesterday, with stunning pictures of guns drawn in the House of Representatives and hand-to-hand combat with police. Lawmakers were seen walking down a staircase to an underground tunnel on way to a secure office building. And then approximately at 3:33 a.m. this morning, Congress certified enough electoral votes to surpass the 270 threshold that guaranteed that Joe Biden would become the 46th president, effectively ending a desperate bid by Trump and his supporters to overturn the results of the November election. The votes for President of the United States are as follows. Joseph R. Biden, Jr. of the state of Delaware, has received 306 votes, and Donald J. Trump of the state of Florida has received 232 votes, and this was said by Vice President Mike Pence in his declaration. Congress has formally affirmed President-elect Joe Biden's victory, completing that final step in the electoral process. President Trump, for the first time, acknowledged his defeat in the election and announced there would be an orderly transition on the 20th of January. The unprecedented violence that Trump supporters wreaked on the U.S. Capitol yesterday spurred a wave of Republican criticism of the president, suggesting the potential for the GOP to increasingly distance itself from Trump as he leaves office. It took 5 years of Donald Trump shouting his authoritarian intent for Republican Party leaders to wake up and try to stop him. The storming of the Capitol by his supporters has prompted calls by some lawmakers to remove him from office before President-elect Joe Biden is sworn in on the 20th of January, and calls to invoke the 25th Amendment and remove him are growing. As the U.S. Capitol went in lockdown and congressional offices were evacuated due to hundreds of these supporters storming the building, the National Guard was called in on the direction of the president. And all it took for social media giants Twitter and Facebook to even temporarily bar President Trump from addressing their vast audience was this violent insurrection. Representatives of the companies said they are still working to remove threads and calls of violence from the social media platforms. as the U.S. Senate resumed debating the Republican challenge against Joe Biden's presidential election victory. Democratic leader Chuck Schumer said that January the 6th, 2021 will live forever in infamy. Former President Obama broke his silence on the siege on the U.S. Capitol and said that his successor had incited the violence. History will rightly remember today's violence at the Capitol, incited by a sitting president who has continued to baselessly lie about the outcome of a lawful election, as a moment of great dishonor and shame for our nation. And former President George W. Bush has also spoken out on the Capitol building's mob invasion and said the scenes of mayhem unfolding in the seat of our nation's government is in disbelief and dismay is what she is watching. It is sickening and heartbreaking. Governor Andrew Cuomo said the violence that occurred at the U.S. Capitol should be called a failed attempt to a coup. And First Lady Melania Trump's chief of staff has resigned amid the siege. Their White House Deputy Press Secretary announced she was also resigning, as did White House Social Secretary Ricky Nikata and many others. Georgians, meanwhile, earlier in the day, elected John Ossoff to the U.S. Senate, giving the Democratic Party control of the Congress and White House for the first time in a decade and delivering a stark repudiation of President Trump as he tried to overturn his own loss. President-elect Joe Biden has decided to nominate Judge Merrick Garland as Attorney General, and Lisa Monaco, a former Homeland Security advisor in the Obama administration, has become a close aide to Biden to be the Deputy Attorney General, and has also selected Vanita Gupta, who served as Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General and led the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice under President Obama, to be the Associate Attorney General. The storming of the U.S. Congress has left America's image as a beacon of democracy severely tarnished, with allies unable to hide their shock and authoritarian regimes gleefully exploiting the unrest. They were quick to pour scorn on the U.S. over the storming of the Capitol building. An arrest warrant has been issued for the outgoing President Trump in connection with the killing of an Iranian general and a powerful Iraqi militia leader last year. The warrant was issued by a judge in Baghdad's investigative court, tasking with probing the Washington-directed drone strike that killed General Qasem Soleimani. Israel has struck targets in southern Syria in the third such an attack in nearly 10 days. And Arab states boycotting Qatar could resume travel and trade links with Doha within a week under a United States-backed deal, but restoring diplomatic ties requires more time as parties work to rebuild trust. Separate attacks in southern Afghanistan have left at least 11 civilians and security forces dead, even as Afghan negotiators were in Qatar to resume talks with the Taliban aimed at finding an end to decades of conflict. Ethiopia's federal government has long denied persistent claims that Eritrean troops were in Tigray, where Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed launched a military offensive against dissident regional leaders in November that left thousands dead. And the rights group urging Libya's UN-backed government to investigate the fate of hundreds of people missing from a key town near the capital of Tripoli. The European Union can no longer legally recognize Venezuelan opposition leader Juan Guaido as the country's legitimate head of state, and the European Union should meanwhile send coronavirus vaccines to its Balkan neighbors and do more to combat the virus in those 13 countries. Germany facing the risk of a much longer coronavirus lockdown if the federal states do not consistently implement tougher restrictions. And transport services were cut off to a city of 11 million people near Beijing today as local officials were reprimanded for a COVID-19 outbreak that pushed China's new infections to the highest single-day tally since July. Ladies and gentlemen, you're listening to the World News on Radio Caravan. The Westminster Magistrates Court in London is set to start a 2-day hearing in the extradition case of diamond heir Nirav Modi today. And he, of course, is lodged in the Wandsworth prison in West London and facing extradition to India on charges of major financial offences linked to a Mumbai branch of the Punjab National Bank. India calling for introspection within the United Nations Security Council over the lack of representation of African countries among its permanent members, as most of the issues on the agenda of the council are related to the continent. Renowned Indian motorcycler racer C.S. Santosh has suffered a crash during the ongoing Dakar rally in Saudi Arabia and put in medically induced coma after being airlifted to a hospital in Riyadh. Union Health Minister Harshvardhan held a meeting with health ministers of states and union territories a day before the nationwide COVID-19 vaccine dry run. Government preparing a detailed draft for air transportation of these vaccines as India crossed the 1 crore mark in recoveries, becoming the first country in the world to report more than 10 million cured patients, recording also a 6-month low for new coronavirus cases. The Supreme Court cited a gathering at the Tablighi Jamaat's headquarters in Delhi that was blamed for a jump in COVID-19 infections and asking the centre as to what guidelines were in place to prevent a similar situation at the farmers' protests. The traffic likely to be disrupted on the outskirts of Delhi on the 43rd day of the farmers' agitation. And farmers in Uttarakhand district took out a tractor parade against farm laws and said that they were not going to be silent till the farm laws were withdrawn by the Narendra Modi government. At least 4 states in India have reported bird deaths due to avian influenza. And Satya Paul, the founder of the eponymous fashion clothing brand, has died in Coimbatore yesterday. Former Indian captain and current BCCI President Sourav Ganguly discharged from the Woodlands Hospital in Kolkata after being declared clinically fit. And India versus Australia, third test, day 1. Australia were 166 for the loss of 2 wickets. And New Zealand became the world's #1 ranked test cricket team for the first time after a comprehensive victory over Pakistan.